What if I told you that after the One Ring was destroyed and Sauron fell, Tom Bombadil left his beloved old forest for the first time in an age to meet with Elrond in Rivendell? This isn't something Tolkien wrote directly, but when you piece together the fragments from his letters, the hints scattered throughout Middle-earth's history, and the profound changes that swept across the world after the War of the Ring, a fascinating picture emerges of two ancient beings sharing perhaps the most important conversation in the Fourth Age. The destruction of the ring didn't just end Sauron's reign of terror. It fundamentally altered the fabric of Middle-earth itself. The magic that had sustained the elven rings was fading, the age of men was dawning, and powers that had existed since the elder days were preparing to pass into memory. For Tom Bombadil, who had witnessed the awakening of the elves and the rise and fall of kingdoms, this moment represented something unprecedented. The world he had known since before time began was ending. Picture this scene unfolding in the weeks after Frodo and Sam returned to the Shire. While celebrations echoed across Gondor and Rohan, and the scattered remnants of Sauron's forces fled into hiding, something stirred in the old forest. For the first time in living memory, Tom Bombadil felt the pull of the wider world, not because of danger or darkness, but because of change so profound that even he, master of his own domain, could not ignore it. The meeting would have taken place in autumn, when the leaves of Rivendell burned gold and red like the memories of ages past. Elrond, preparing for his departure to the Grey Havens and the journey west, would have sensed Tom's approach long before the cheerful figure in his yellow boots appeared on the paths leading to Imladris. For Elrond, who had seen the rise and fall of Gil-galad, who had stood beside Isildur in the fires of Mount Doom, the sight of Tom Bombadil walking freely beyond his forest borders would have been both wondrous and deeply troubling. Their first exchange wouldn't have been one of formal greetings or political discourse. Tom, being Tom, would have arrived humming one of his nonsensical songs, perhaps something about the changing of seasons or the way rivers remember their sources. But Elrond, with his gift for seeing the deeper currents of fate, would have understood immediately that this visit carried weight beyond Tom's usual cheerful manner. In the quiet halls of Rivendell, these two ancient beings would have sat together as equals, perhaps for the first time since the world was young. Elrond, bearer of Vilya, the mightiest of the three, felt the fading of its power with each passing day. The ring that had protected Rivendell for thousands of years was becoming little more than a beautiful ornament. Tom, meanwhile, remained as he always had, untouched by the changing tides of power, yet somehow deeply aware of their significance. Their conversation would have begun with the immediate concern that brought Tom from his forest. With the Shire now freed from the shadow, but still bearing its scars, and the world entering an age where the old protections were failing, who would watch over the small folk? Elrond's departure meant the loss of one of Middle-earth's greatest guardians, and while Tom had always remained aloof from the affairs of the outside world, he understood better than most what was at stake. Tom would have spoken of the changes he sensed in the very bones of the earth. The old forest, which had stood as a barrier between past and present, was stirring with new kinds of life. The malice that had once twisted its trees was lifting, but so too was much of the ancient magic that had kept it timeless and apart. Even Old Man Willow seemed somehow diminished, more tree than spirit, as if the great awakening of the Fourth Age was calling all things to choose their final forms. Elrond, ever the wise counsellor, would have shared his own observations. The departure of the ring-bearers to Valinor wasn't just a reward for their service, it was a necessity. The elves who remained would fade, becoming little more than memory and song. The great works of the elder days, from the towers of Annúminas to the bridges of Erygion, were cracking and falling as the power that sustained them drained away. A new kind of world was being born, one built not on the songs of creation or the rings of power, but on the simpler, more fragile strength of mortal hearts. This is where their conversation would have taken its most profound turn. Tom, who had never been bound by ring or crown, who had watched the rise of Sauron with the same mild interest he showed to the changing seasons, found himself facing a question he had never considered. In a world without Elrond's wisdom, without Galadriel's protection, without even Gandalf's guidance, what role would he play? The answer wouldn't have come in grand proclamations or sworn oaths. Tom Bombadil doesn't work that way. Instead, it would have emerged through their shared understanding of what Middle-earth truly was. Not a collection of kingdoms and territories to be ruled, but a living tapestry of stories, songs, and memories. Elrond had spent 3 ages weaving protection around those stories, keeping them safe through the long darkness. Now that responsibility was passing to others. Tom's revelation, if we can call it that, would have been characteristically simple. He would continue to be exactly what he had always been, but his very presence would expand beyond the old forest, not through conquest or rule, but through the quiet influence of joy and freedom touching the world at its most vulnerable moment. The hobbits who had known his hospitality would carry his songs to distant lands. The trees that remembered his voice would whisper his melodies to saplings in far forests. The rivers that had heard Goldberry laugh would carry that laughter to the sea. Elrond would have understood immediately. In a world where magic was fading and the great powers were departing, Tom represented something that could never diminish. Not power in the sense that Sauron craved or even that the elves wielded, but the fundamental force that had shaped Middle-earth before the first song was sung, the power of things simply being what they were meant to be. Their meeting would have lasted 3 days and 3 nights, though time moves differently when immortal beings share their deepest thoughts. They spoke of the Shire and how its simple strength had proven greater than all the armies of the East. They remembered Frodo and Sam, 2 small figures who had walked into darkness and emerged carrying light. They discussed the strange fate of Gollum, whose obsession had somehow served the greater good, and wondered at the mysterious ways that even the smallest choices shape the fate of the world. On the final night, as autumn deepened around Rivendell and the stars wheeled overhead in patterns both ancient and eternal, Tom and Elrond would have shared their most precious memories. Elrond spoke of Gil-galad's sacrifice, of the music he had heard in Valinor as a child, of the bitter joy of watching mortals achieve greatness that even elves could not match. Tom, in his rambling way, told stories of the first trees, of rivers that once sang themselves to sleep, of the day he first saw Goldberry dancing in the rain and knew that he had found the other half of his eternal song. As dawn broke on the 4th day, Tom prepared to return to his forest, but not as the same being who had left it. Something fundamental had shifted, not in his nature, which remained as free and joyful as ever, but in his understanding of his place in the world. Elrond's departure didn't mean the end of protection for Middle-earth. It meant the beginning of a different kind of guardianship, one rooted not in rings of power or ancient bloodlines, but in the simple persistence of hope and wonder. Elrond, for his part, found his own burden lightening. The responsibility he had carried for 3,000 years wasn't ending, but transforming. In the Grey Havens he would board a ship bound for the Undying Lands, but part of his purpose would remain in Middle-earth, woven into the songs Tom would sing and the stories that would grow from them. Their farewell was typical of both beings. Tom offered Elrond a flower from Golberry's garden, bright yellow like his boots, with instructions to plant it in Valinor and see if songs could grow in perfect soil. Elrond gave Tom a simple silver bell crafted in the elder days that would ring whenever the wind carried news of distant friends. Not magical in the way the three rings had been magical, but precious in the way that gifts between friends are always precious. As Tom walked back toward the old forest, his step was lighter despite the weight of new understanding. Behind him, Elrond stood in the doorway of his house, watching until the cheerful figure disappeared among the trees. Both knew that they would not meet again in Middle-earth, but both also knew that their friendship would endure in ways deeper than physical presence. The changes that followed were subtle but profound. The old forest began to welcome visitors in a way it never had before, not aggressively or obviously, but with a gentleness that made travelers pause and remember why they had once loved simple things like the sound of wind in leaves or the way sunlight danced on water. Stories began to spread of a merry fellow who could be found along certain paths, always ready with a song and a kind word, never staying long but somehow always appearing when most needed. Meanwhile, ships sailed from the grey havens carrying the last of the ring-bearers to their reward. But they also carried something else, something few noticed but many felt. The songs that Tom had taught Elrond, the melodies that reminded listeners of spring rain and wildflowers, began to echo in Valinor itself. The undying lands, perfect in their timeless beauty, were enriched by memories of a more fragile world, where joy was precious precisely because it could be lost. In the Shire, life continued its gentle rhythm, but with a new depth of contentment. The hobbits who had known Tom's hospitality during the War of the Ring found themselves humming tunes they couldn't quite remember learning, tunes that somehow made even the most ordinary tasks feel like celebrations. Gardens bloomed with unusual vigor, and children played games that seemed to come from nowhere but felt as ancient as the hills. The wider world, too, felt the influence of this strange partnership between departing wisdom and eternal joy. In Gondor, Aragorn found his dreams filled with songs of peace rather than memories of war. In Rohan, the horses ran with a freedom that reminded their riders of the early days of the world. Even in distant lands where the name of Tom Bombadil had never been spoken, something shifted in the air, a sense that the world was both vaster and more intimate than anyone had imagined. Years passed, and the Fourth Age settled into its stride. The elves faded as Elrond had predicted, but their departure was gentler than expected, softened by the understanding that beauty and wonder would endure in different forms. The kingdoms of men grew strong and prosperous, but retained something of the humility they had learned during the War of the Ring. The Shire expanded and flourished, becoming not just a home for hobbits, but a symbol of the simple happiness that all peoples could aspire to. Through it all, Tom Bombadil continued his wandering, though few could say exactly where or when. Some claimed to have met him on the roads leading to Bree, others swore they had heard his voice singing in the depths of Fangorn Forest. Rangers reported glimpses of yellow boots dancing along the borders of the Shire, and sailors sometimes heard laughter that seemed to come from the waves themselves. The truth was simpler and more complex than any of these stories suggested. Tom had become something unprecedented in Middle-earth's history, a guardian whose presence was felt not through power or authority, but through the quiet insistence that joy was always possible, that wonder could be found in the smallest moments, and that freedom was not something to be won or lost, but something to be lived. As the Fourth Age deepened and memory of the elder days faded into legend, the meeting between Tom Bombadil and Elrond became the foundation of something new in Middle-earth. Not a return to the magic of earlier ages, but a different kind of enchantment altogether. One that worked not through rings or spells or ancient bloodlines, but through the simple recognition that in a world full of darkness, choosing to sing is itself a revolutionary act. The children of that age grew up with stories of talking trees and magical rings, of great kings and terrible battles, but they also grew up with something more subtle and more lasting, an understanding that the most powerful magic of all was the decision to find beauty in ordinary things, to treat strangers with kindness, and to remember that even in the darkest times, somewhere in the world, someone was singing. And in the deepest part of the old forest, where time moves differently and seasons blend into one eternal moment of becoming, Tom Bombadil and Goldberry continued their ancient dance. But now it carried echoes of distant shores and the memory of wise eyes that had seen too much but chosen to hope anyway. The song was the same, but richer for having been shared, deeper for having touched the world beyond the woods, and more beautiful for carrying within it the promise that endings could also be beginnings. This was their gift to the Fourth Age and all the ages that would follow. Not the promise that sorrow would end or that darkness would never return, but the assurance that no matter how heavy the world became, there would always be someone, somewhere, ready to remind it how to dance.